Thank you for choosing to stay with us now. Financial woes for consumers are far from over. With grave debts, fuel spikes and higher taxes, the already cash-strapped consumer are already stretched thin. Credit providers further exacerbate their plight by offering loans, often borrowing from one creditor to pay another. We're joined by the Credit Information and Research Manager, Louisa Hetisani from the National Credit Regulator to tell us more. Louisa, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get into this classification of what indebtedness is, because I do think a lot of people, they hear the word, but they don't completely understand it.
If I can just explain, you've got indebtedness. I mean, we all have debt. For example, there's certain items, things like your house and your car. It's not things that you can necessarily buy for cash. So therefore, you have debt, and debt is not always a bad thing. Now, over indebtedness, now that's a whole other story. Now that means your expenses are more than your income. So there's more, month at the end of your salary, if I can put it like that.
We've seen legislation put in place to try and curb the way money is borrowed to the consumer, how the consumer accesses money, and yet we still seem to face this problem that there are people borrowing money recklessly.
That is true. If I can just give you some statistics, the total debtors book, that is how much do we owe as South Africans towards credit providers, is 1.5 trillion rand. And about 52% of that debt is, of course, houses, which is not a bad thing. But then what you see is that when we look at the profile of consumers at the credit bureaus, the bureaus tell us that there's 22 million credit active consumers in South Africa. But what is scary is that almost half are struggling to repay their debts. We're sitting in a situation where 55% of consumers are able to service their debts monthly. That means they're not more than 2 months behind in installments. And the balance of 45%, which is roughly 10 million people, are 3 months or more behind in their installments. Some have got adverse listings, some even have got judgments.
Let's talk about the Credit Act and the kind of the job it needed to do, excuse me, and the kind of work it had to do. And yet, in many ways, it's still kind of falling short. What's wrong with the Credit Act?
You will understand that the Act was relatively new. It's about 8 years old now. And the Act has a number of objectives. It seeks to ensure that we've got a sustainable and, fair credit market. And at the same time, the Act speaks about access to credit. So you had people who were historically disadvantaged, who the Act aims to ensure that they do have access to, the right kinds of credit. But of course, with any legislation, you will have unintended consequences. That's why in March, we had the amendment to the Act, as well as increased regulations. Now, specifically around strengthening around issues of lending, we've got the affordability assessment regulations that aim to strengthen or to guide credit providers in terms of how should assessments be done. Now, it's things that you would assume that they are being done by all credit providers. For example, when a consumer asks for credit, verify the income. You cannot have a situation where I just tell you that I earn 50,000 a month and you take my word for it.
And in many ways, the law's changing around that too. It's becoming more stricter for people. You have to prove what you earn now.
Exactly. There is an obligation on the lender, for example, to verify my income, either through a pay slip or 3 months bank statement, or the Act provides for different kinds of documentation. Now, more importantly, it's the issue of expenses. What we've seen in the past is that lenders will take what the consumer says. For example, now because I know I've got high expenses, when I go in, I will tell them what I think they need to hear so that I can get the loan. So now the new regulations issued in March of this year give sort of like minimum living expense norms to say, for example, if Louisa earns 10,000 a month, this is typically what somebody who earns 10,000 would spend, as a minimum on their expenses.
Let's quickly talk about the cost of living, because there was a recent increase in the petrol price that has a knock-on effect on bread and basically everything that falls under that cost of living. Talk to me about the implication of combined salaries, because I often feel that when you're a couple in your household, Mr. X earns so much and Mrs. X earns so much, so there isn't a proper management system, because between the two of them, they think they can afford it. And they can't.
That is very important. Even within the legislation, the new regulations say, for example, if we're a married couple, we must be seen as a joint applicant. Now, you spoke about, the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. That means we need to go back to basics. We need to have a budget. Let's sit down as a couple and say, this is our joint household income, and these are expenses. What can we afford? What can't we afford?
We're going to leave it there, but Louisa, very informative. Louisa Hetisani, who is the Credit Information and Research Manager at the National Credit Regulator, talking to us about some real-life issues, financial woes, as petrol price increased a day ago, and that knocks onto bread prices, milk prices, and we're going to have to become budget conscious. Well, let us know what you think. Morning Live at SABC.co.za. Take an ad break. You don't get it.